Greetings, gentlemen, gentlewomen, and gentle non-traditionally gendered folk. You are in the presence of RVRocks, and you are watching the Little Intricacies, the show where we talk about your favorite pictures and the minute details that enhance their quality. So, today, we are traveling back in time.
Video games are cool. I really like video games. I mean, look at me. But at the end of the day, a lot of the quote-unquote big video games fall into the same territory and trends. Large, 3D, expansive open worlds, battle royale, shooty games, that kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love these types of video games. I sink plenty of time into stuff like Overwatch, Fortnite, and Warzone. But they all have a similar look and feel most of the time because, well, the industry. It all works. But indie games are super cool because they can break that tradition and create a truly new experience. Without a bajillion shareholders on their back, they're free to explore and create some wonderful new ideas. Some of my favorite games from the past few years have been weird, non-traditional experiences. Wandersong is all about singing as a game mechanic. Snake Pass is a platformer where you slither around as a snake. Crypt of the Necrodancer is a dungeon crawler in which you have to move in time with the beat of the background music.
But none of them have quite a stylistic identity as flashy and distinct as Cuphead.
Oh, Cuphead. This game rocked the internet multiple times before its release, and well, just look at it. It's so clean and nice looking. Modeled after the Fleischer cartoons of the 1930s, it captures the eyes and hearts of people everywhere. A tough-as-nails platformer slash shoot-'em-up game all about boss fights and embracing the oddly terrifying yet hauntingly beautiful cartoons that led us to this modern age of animation. It's a pretty wide net they have cast, and no one was surprised when it made it big like it did. Coming out to critical acclaim and love from all corners of the internet. Hell, I'm not sure if anyone even remembers it at this point, but Cuphead, Crash Bandicoot, and Dark Souls were three big proponents of the difficulty in video games discussion that propped up a few years ago. And while it may have taken me 3 copies of the game on different platforms to finally play it to completion, I fell in love with the game too. It's one of those video game knockouts. Great fluid gameplay, banging music, lovable art direction. It's awesome and nostalgic. But how did it get that nostalgic flair to it? Well, we all know they did it by simulating the art style of older cartoons, but what exactly are the steps taken to achieve that goal?
Well, you will find that out and more on today's show, because this is the Little Intricacies of Cuphead's Antiquated Adventure.
There are 4 fundamentals of Cuphead's design: the animation, the music, the gameplay, and how it all combines to form one unified whole. To start, the animation, but before that, the art style. Cuphead is an homage to the old-fashioned cartoons of yesteryear. Felix the Cat, Betty Boop, classic Mickey Mouse, that kind of jazz. And you can tell by the simplistic outfits the main characters are donning, the classic black shirt, big boots, glove hands, and recognizable face. Hell, even Cuphead's coloring is inconsistent as a reference to how characters in posters would often have different color schemes than in the cartoon. This kind of character design was common back then. Bosses are meant to look more menacing though, and thus follow a different design philosophy, having larger-than-life presences, often based off of single character ideas. For example, pirates, bees, Medusa, scientist, ghost, candy, vegetables, and my favorite of the bunch, sunflower. These guys are all bosses, and in the way of most video game boss fights, they have different phases throughout the encounter. But unlike most video games, these guys really shift when activating their next phase. Rather than just getting a new move or a fun new attack, more often than not, there's a whole new beast in front of you than what was lying before. The developers, Chad and Jared Moldenhauer, have stated that these oddities are indicative how in the olden days of animation, since it was a smaller production, animators could go crazy in the small details. Have someone with a cup for a head transform into a tank, that kind of jazz. That kind of only acceptable in older cartoon logic that allows a girl to turn into a zeppelin, then into a bull, then into twins, then an archer, then the moon, while still being recognizable in each step. But that all lies in the art. Looking at this still, it's super good, very nice looking, but then you remember that it's all moving, and there are 24 of these pictures playing each second. And you better bet they killed that with authenticity too. Cuphead is hand animated on paper, delivering authentic 1930s style rubber hose animation by hand. Which, I don't even know if I need to state this, but let's just say that's a bitch of a workload. They did make this easier for themselves by digitally coloring the images afterwards, but in the name of accuracy, they defied all modern conventions. And well, it worked out for them amazingly. Earlier I said this game has 24 frames of animation per second, but this is actually a more complicated issue. See, there are a bunch of common frame rates, but the norm for most animation projects is 24 frames per second. meaning that every second 24 pictures are displayed. But for video games, the norm is typically 60 frames per second, which means, you guessed it, 60 individual images every second. So Cuphead, a video game built on the backbone of 1930s animation, handles this disparity by doing both. The game itself runs at 60 frames per second, meaning that Cuphead over here will move every 1/60th of a second, but all animations are 24 frames per second. So it has that video game buttery smoothness while maintaining that animation perfectionism boasted by the Moldenhauer brothers. The backgrounds are all watercolor paintings, also done by hand. While not necessarily accurate to 1930s cartoons, it's very reflective of that old animation quirk where you kinda knew what the characters were going to interact with due to that being colored differently from the rest of the scene. From a game design perspective, this is smart. You can tell very clearly what is going to be played with and what is going to be left in background based on how it's colored. And in some of the backgrounds, they have real-life physical objects digitally edited into the background, similarly to how a lot of old films use real-life space and objects because, well, digital techniques didn't exist back then. Plus, it also helps nail in that unique style.
Now that's all fine and dandy, but as any good film student would tell you, visuals are only 50% of the filmmaking process. So how does Cuphead handle its auditory sensations?
Well, since the entire game was based off 1930s animation, they decided to record it as if they were in that era as well, which means live, big band recording. Every song in the game has this distinct jazzy feel, and it was all captured in-house. Kris Maddigan, the composer of Cuphead, had never composed pieces outside of school before this game. And the music, much like everything else, mopped the floor with its competitors in award shows. The music does defy most traditional animation at the time though in one big way. Most music paired with films in yesteryear were synced to go with the action. Cuphead doesn't do that, but this serves as a benefit in a different way. You might be thinking to yourself, video games don't have synced music with the action, dummy, and well, yeah, they do. It's just a bit more complicated, and much more genre specific. Whether it be the game winding down to a climactic conclusion, a tense emotional moment while being provided exposition, or a dramatic swell as a big event happens on screen. Video games have definitely had their share of synced music. But by lacking this feature, Cuphead harkens back to the design of retro video games as well as retro animation. As most retro video games had one song that went throughout the entire level as opposed to a dynamic score.
And that's not all.
Cuphead's game design is lovingly retro through and through. I mentioned earlier that this game is very hard. Well, not to toot my own horn or anything, but it's not that hard, more so unexpectedly difficult. But its genre is something that isn't all that popular nowadays. The run and gun shoot 'em up with platforming elements. I mean, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I can't think of the last time a mainstream video game tried to tackle this type of gameplay. Other than, well, the game that defined it, Contra. And this was intentional. The Moldenhauer bros wanted the game to have that retro gameplay, being obsessed with fine-tuning the hitboxes and recovery time to be perfectly punishing. They even have the Guinness World Record for most boss fights in a run-and-gun video game.
So how does this all swirl into a menagerie of contently camped cops that comfortably crowded the contentious corners of the World Wide Web?
Well, all these meticulous details add into a melting pot of retro nostalgia. Regardless of your age, you can look back at something in this game and be familiar with it. The animation and art style, the implementation and style of the music, the genre of gameplay. It all swirls into a distinctly retro experience, firing on all cylinders. By all accounts, this is a new retro game. While still holding up to the quality of modern game experiences, it very much feels like at times you are plopped into one of those 1930s movies. And it's an experience like no other. Chad and Jared Moldenhauer went through hell and back to get this game made. Spent years in development hell. They even remortgaged their house to keep it funded. However, through all this perfectionism and risks to keep their dream afloat, they have made one of the most unique games of the past 2 decades. With this amount of work going into the experience, I can't wait for the eventual delicious last course to take me on a whole new adventure.
And if you want to join little old me for a whole new adventure, make sure to subscribe to RVRocks, like this video, and comment what your favorite retro property is.
If you like seeing the behind the scenes of Cuphead, I recommend you check out How Cuphead's Devs Gambled on a Dream, The Making of Cuphead. It's a small, very well put together documentary by the people over at GameSpot. It's fun to see all the little things that have come together to make this game the experience that it is.
But before you do any of that, I have been RVRocks, and thank you so much for partaking in my wares. Farewell!
Let's spread